So hi everybody, welcome to the comeback. we we were on break for a couple weeks and now we're back. They're back. and welcome to this Wednesday evening session, Thursday morning for some of us. And we're going to be looking at in the preface on Roman numeral page 11 XI in what it says, and we're going to look at a little bit of paragraph 6 because tonight's topic is um, going to be about, um, well, the topic that I sent out in the email was grief, loss, and lack. There's all kinds of synonyms in the word in the course for all those words: deprivation, scarcity, um, limits, and we're going to look at all that stuff, and then certainly look at the idea of grief and the feelings that are associated with the sense of loss and what they're all about, certainly from an ego's point of view and then from the Holy Spirit's point of view. So um, the idea of the feeling of grief because we've lost something, somebody, a loved one, or it could have been loss of anything, a pet, a job, uh, a situation that we were familiar with, the place we used to live, maybe moving to a new place, and we're grieving the loss of anything. Could be anything, and all that's based on um, early on what Jesus calls the scarcity principle. That we set it up so that we would have this sense that we need stuff and that we are lacking, we are inadequate, and we need to fill that with something or somebody. And when that thing seemingly, or that person seemingly kind of vacates or disappears or betrays us, or in whatever sense we lose them, there's a sense of loss, there's a sense of grief, there's a grieving that takes place. And that's all based on what Jesus calls very early on in the preface itself, the scarcity principle. And I just want to read a little bit about that. Paragraph 6, they're not numbered, but it's the paragraph that begins, sin is defined as lack of love. Sin is defined as lack of love. So we could say sin is defined as loss of love. Sin is defined as limited love. I mean, all those words are synonymous. Since love is all there is, sin in the sight of the Holy Spirit is a mistake to be corrected rather than an evil to be punished. Our sense of inadequacy, weakness, and incompletion, another synonym for loss, comes from the strong investment in the quote-unquote scarcity principle that governs the whole world of illusions. And just to to get even intellectually, to get that kind of framed in terms of what the course is talking about, what the scarcity principle is that basically in terms of our chart, um, we played around with the idea of separation, the tiny mad idea of separation. We left heaven, and then we made up a story of sin, guilt, and fear to reinforce our belief that we actually left heaven. And then rather than let that go, we wind up projecting that onto ourselves as bodies moving in a world full of other bodies. So one of the ways, and so the loss and the grief that we experience in the world seems to be due to worldly things, worldly issues. One body loses another body. Whether it's, I've lost the place I used to live, or my car got, crashed, or a pet or a loved one dies, or some, they could get, some kind of debilitating disease and they're not present the way they used to be. All kinds of loss in the world. And then and then there's the corresponding grief, the corresponding. I don't. We don't feel good about that. Whatever words you want to, and the range is from all the way from, like he says in lesson 21, 22, slight irritation, mild sadness to totally feeling wiped out, devastation. And he's talking about those feelings and that sense of loss in the world um, isn't what is really what's going on from the Course's point of view, because what we thought and we experienced as loss here, and the feeling of grief due to that loss in the world, is really coming from the original tiny mad idea of loss. I mean, we call it the tiny mad idea of separation. We could call it the tiny mad idea of scarcity. We could call it the tiny mad idea of lack of love, the tiny mad idea of limits, the tiny mad idea of inadequacy, the tiny mad idea of weakness, the tiny mad idea of incompletion. And so that it's always good, I think, to even intellectually step back and remember and remind ourselves that what's happening is everything here in the world that we think is loss and is causing us some kind of pain or grief is really always coming from matrix central, this tiny mad idea of separation, tiny mad idea I've lost my connection with my father. And the reinforcement of that through the storytelling, and then the totally forgetting that this is the source by projecting it onto the world. And I'm not minimizing how much loss we can feel in the world and how much grieving we can feel in the world. But Jesus is just totally uncompromising. That's not why we're grieving. We're grieving because we threw him out the window inside. And now, as brutal as it sounds, and as it's kind of hard to hear this, especially from an ego point of view, that whatever is going on down here that we think we're grieving about is just basically a diversion, a distraction, if you will, from what the real grieving is that's going on internally, because we pushed God away. We've separated from source. We've lost God, and it's our fault. That's what the guilt is. There's a line in the Song of Prayer that really hit me, and you don't have to turn to it. I'll just read it. For future reference, it's in the very first section on prayer. It's in the second section of prayer, Roman numeral 2, the ladder of prayer, and it's paragraph 3 at the bottom of paragraph 3. He says, without guilt, there is no scarcity. And I had to sit with that one. I'm like, really? Without guilt, there is no loss. Without guilt, there is no grief. It was just like, there's obviously, he's pointing out there's a direct correlation between believing that we're guilty for having separated from heaven and the grief we're feeling due to that. And all this grief down here, or whatever loss it is we think we're grieving about, is simply hanging on to guilt, not letting it go, and that leads to that feeling of grief. And it's always this. And go ahead, Bruce.
Oh, I was just going to say, it seems like that what you're describing very eloquently is one example of how the Course tries to get us to generalize, and using grief and loss as examples. It seems like if we take any thought in the Holy Spirit's thought system and any thought in the ego's thought system, you could say that they're mutually exclusive. So without without any thought in the ego's thought system, including grief, there's no innocence. There's no any.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, just kind of struck me as you were sharing that really this could be one mechanism for generalizing. Yeah.
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 And at that point, when we go internally, all those words are synonymous. So this could be the tiny mad idea of guilt, the tiny mad idea of grief, that I could even grieve about losing something I couldn't lose in the first place. I mean, our identity as one son is still intact. What I thought was really interesting as I was going through this process was when he said, without guilt, there is no scarcity. I don't even have to believe that. In fact, I can't believe that. But what I can do is start to work with the guilt, your guilt first, and then eventually my own sense of guilt, which your guilt is covering up my sense of guilt, or my perception of your guilt is covering up my own internal guilt. But it's like I don't have to go around saying I am the Son of God. I don't have to go around saying I have no needs. I don't have to go around saying I am sinless. But the way the process works, the way I can get back to letting go of grief is simply, not simply, but thank God it works, it is the forgiveness process itself. I can't grieve if I believe you're sinless. I can't grieve if I believe I'm sinless. Without guilt, there is no guilt. No, there is no grief. Without guilt, there is no scarcity. There is no sense of lack. So the grief is directly proportional to how much guilt I'm laying on you and me in any given moment. And it gets buried in all the craziness. But when it comes to the surface, intensely, when one of these dramas that we're really attached to in life, in so-called life, somebody dies, or we lose a pet, or something terrible happens and we grieve that. But that's just kind of like the venting a little compared to the grief we're actually feeling because we're hanging on to guilt in any given moment. So the way to let go of grief, ironically enough, to me anyway, as I was thinking about this, is simply the forgiveness process. I go start looking at who I'm holding guilty, who I'm pointing the finger at, and I start the forgiveness process with them. And it could be. I mean, it's impossible to be grieving about a loved one and still not be blaming somebody or something for that. Could be God for taking the loved one away. Could be the loved one because they didn't take care of themselves and they died. I mean, there's even in the midst of all this grief, there's guilt not so far below the surface that we can get in touch with. And it's not the real guilt, but we start with that and we work with that. And so the first step of forgiveness is, am I willing to see you the way Jesus is seeing you without laying this guilt trip on you? Am I willing to let go of all my resentments about you and what you might have done or didn't do for a moment and see you the way Jesus does, as innocent, that your innocence is still intact? And in that experience, I begin to back up and realize the guilt that I'm hanging on to about even wanting to see you that way. That there's always this need to see people as guilty, so I don't deal with my own guilt and let that go. So it's always the process of forgiveness that, good news, it helps us let go of guilt, but the really good news, it helps us let go of all these terrible feelings like grief that are associated with hanging on to guilt, and we're not even aware of that. I mean, that's what the Course kind of is putting in our face. What if this is what's really going on? What if I'm not grieving for the reason I think? What if it's got nothing to do with this? And so I start with this, and I use it as a classroom to ask Jesus to help me see this the way he's seeing it, and see what's really going on behind the person or the thing that I'm grieving about. And then as I move from there, I eventually go back to here, where the real source of grief is, where the real source of guilt is. And then, second step for forgiveness, am I willing to ask Jesus to let go of believing I'm the guilty party, that I left heaven, and stop insisting on that I left heaven. Stop insisting that the tiny mad idea of loss is true. I did not lose my innocence. And to let him, in a very loving, kind way, tell me that. And then in those two experiences of moving from here to here, I'll know my loved ones didn't die. I'll know our innocence did not die. I mean, and it's a real palpable experience. We just had a couple pretty hardworking course students lost loved ones over the past couple months or so, that we know and that we're close to, and it's been rough. It was rough, but like in one case, it was amazing to watch this guy we know go through it, and I've interacted with him a number of times since his wife passed away, but I don't get a sense that I get a sense that he's okay with it. And almost like I hope I'm that good when the next time the proverbial whatever hits the fan and I got to deal with some kind of loss, and use him as a model for maintaining that awareness that his wife didn't die. Her body died, but she didn't, and he didn't either. He didn't die with her. So I mean, it's just, am I willing to go there? Am I willing to ask Jesus for help? Um, I think one of the I don't know, not so common, because I mean I think we as course students we make all kinds of common mistakes, level confusions for sure. But one of the things that I see course students not do is they don't ask Jesus for help to see that their loved one isn't gone. And I see them hang on to a lot of pain because of that. And yeah, I get like, well, try it for God's sake. you know, Ask Jesus to show you something else. And yeah, so remind me that whenever anything goes down. Any questions or comments on any of this so far?
This is really good. Yeah, it just seems like there's so many ways that that we can look at all the different things we grieve, like you say, and just notice. And I really like that you're, the level of confusion, and then asking for help to see that there's no loss. Yeah, and truth. That's always helpful. Good stuff.
Yeah,
Very helpful.
very good. Um, it was interesting. One of our friends whose loved one passed away just this month, was she had asked me about some places in the course that were dealing with the loss, and I I couldn't come up with it. I knew about this Song of Prayer thing, the last section about death. Um, but the irony was was these next three lessons over the next 3 days are all about loss and grieving, and the suffering from the great grief. Like for example, lesson 248 on page 417, which yeah, I guess that's tomorrow's lesson. And whatever suffers is not part of me. And this is really the gist of it. I mean, this is what going back to the mind and realizing I made a thing that could suffer, and then I identified with it. I made up a separate ego self that could suffer, that could go through sin, guilt, and fear, and actually believe those feelings are real. I believe I'm this thing that suffers. And then that clarification that whatever suffers is not part of me. This is the second step, I think, of forgiveness, is to allow Jesus to tell us that. The first step of forgiveness is to say, look at the world and say, I'm not suffering because of what you did. And then to go internally and with Jesus' help, look at, I'm not suffering because I separated. I'm not this separate thing. And that's what he affirms. That's what Lynn pointed out to me yesterday. Throughout this whole thing, he's saying he will help us let go of suffering. He will let go of letting go of pain. He will help us let go of believing in death. But what he's saying in this lesson is this. He says, you're not the thing that suffers. You're not a thing that can suffer. You're not a thing that can grieve. Your true reality is a thing that cannot die. Your loved one's true reality cannot suffer, cannot die. And he's just totally adamant here. And he says, lesson 248, the first sentence, I have disowned the truth. I threw out the truth with the tiny mad idea of loss. I threw out the truth with the tiny mad idea that I could grieve. I could be in a state of grief about losing my identity as a son of God. I've disowned that truth. I threw it away. I can take it back with Jesus' help. Now let me be as faithful in disowning falsity as I was in disowning the truth. You know, like, I mean, it's the good thing about recovery, even in 12 steps. You take all this energy that you use to feed your addiction and you turn that around and you start feeding your recovery instead. And in this case, it starts opening up to let Jesus feed us the truth instead of listening to the ego's lies that we are this thing that can suffer and die. It goes on, line 3, whatever suffers is not part of me. What suffers ain't me. I'm not the thing that can suffer. What grieves is not myself. I mean, it's like bam, bam, bam here. It's just like, I mean, I might not want to hear this when I'm in a state of grief down here in the world, but I mean, thank God there's a lifeline that eventually, if I'm ready to grab it, it's there.
It's it's coming to me as you're saying that. It's all made up. It's part of the self-concept. And our self-concept includes suffering and pain and loss. And so, you know, we long for those opportunities to keep putting together this concept of ourselves of a sufferer. And that's what we don't want to let go of. Yeah.
Part of the irony of all this is that, and he says this early on, and if we get a chance, we'll look at it. It's in chapter 2. He says part of the irony is that we welcome grief because it proves that we are the thing that we think we became. I'm this thing that can grieve. I'm this thing that can suffer. And then worse, if there is a worse, I've got myself afraid of the atonement. I've got myself afraid to hear that I'm not a thing that can suffer, that my innocence is still intact. He actually says you're afraid that if you listen to the atonement, you will lose. You will have a sense of loss. We think that's the scarcity. He's going to take away this thing that can suffer and die. Really? I mean, that's what he's saying. And when you say it out loud, you go, oh, well.
Pretty silly.
Yeah, and then line 5, what is in pain, this self-made thing that can suffer, what is in pain is simply illusion in my mind. I've chosen to believe in the ego. What dies was never living in reality. The never born can never die. Such a bam kind of line. No compromise there. The never born can never die. What dies was never living in reality and did but mock, make fun of, let go of, whatever words you want to use, but mock the truth about myself, my true self. Now I disown these self-concepts that Lynn was talking about, and deceits and lies about the Holy Son of God that you are and the Holy Son of God that I am. Now am I ready to accept him back as God created him. And then the next lesson is all about the way to do all that is through forgiveness. And we don't have to believe all that stuff. We just have to start with who we're pointing the finger at and be willing to let go of those judgments about my brother, my sister, my enemies, my whatever, and look at the way Jesus is painting a picture of them, not the way I've painted a picture of their guilt. So forgiveness ends all suffering and loss. That's the good news about I don't have to deal with the grief directly. I just have to work the forgiveness process on the guilt. and then the grief will just go away. Without guilt, there is no grief. If I don't get to the guilt, the grief's going to be there and it's going to bubble to the surface the next crazy drama that happens in the world. So forgiveness ends all suffering and loss. Forgiveness paints a picture of a world where suffering is over, loss becomes impossible, anger makes no sense. And that's because it pulls the rug on guilt. Without guilt, there's no loss, there's no scarcity, there's no grief. There's no potential for grief. Attack is gone, judgment is gone, and madness has an end. First madness we deal with is how crazy we are to think our brother is robbing us of our peace. That's pretty crazy, especially since he can't. And then the second madness is I could rob myself of my peace. It's like two crazies back to back, flip sides of the same crazy. What suffering is now conceivable? Well, none. You pull the rug on guilt. What loss can be sustained? Ain't no loss if there ain't no guilt. The world becomes a place of joy, abundance, charity, and endless giving, endless connection. Giving and receiving are the same at the level of the mind. It is now so like to heaven that it quickly is transformed into the light that it reflects. And so the journey which the Son of God began is ended in the light from which it came. And then in the next lesson, he's not using the word loss per se, but he's using the word lack. Loss is in the course about 150 times. So he's in there a lot. And lack is in there the same, about 150 times. And they're just like totally synonymous. And then there's all these other words too. Incomplete, devastation, desolation. I'm sure you can think of about a dozen more. So lesson 250, and this is the process. Let me behold the Son of God today, first in my brother and then in myself, and witness to his glory, first in my brother and then correspondingly in myself. Let me not try to obscure the holy light in him, in you and me, and see his strength diminished and reduced to frailty. I don't have to insist on the tiny mad idea of loss. I can let that go. And I can stop insisting and that his strength is diminished because separation is real, alive, and well, and guilt and grief are both alive and well. Nor perceive the lacks in him, the lack of innocence, the lack of anything I think he's lacking, nor perceive the lacks in him which I would attack his sovereignty as the Son of God, his innocence as the Son of God. And so in that process, it's always line 2, and today I would behold his gentleness instead of my illusions. He is what I am. So it's always in what I offer my brother that I wake up that I am that too. Line 4, today I would see truly this day, this day I may at last identify with him. I might know he's the Son of God and I am too. And then we get to share that with everybody else. Back up to lesson 245. And then the prayer in italics is what he's talking about. We get to share that awareness with our brother. And in sharing that awareness, he ends with that I may come to recognize myself. So Lynn, you want to read 245? We'll get quiet for a minute. Just the first paragraph's good.
Okay. Your peace is with me, Father. I am safe. Your peace surrounds me, Father. Where I go, your peace goes there with me. It sheds its light on everyone I meet. I bring it to the desolate and lonely and afraid. I give your peace to those who suffer pain or grieve for loss or think they are bereft of hope and happiness. Send them to me, my Father. Let me bring your peace with me, for I would save your Son, as is your will, that I may come to recognize myself.
And gently, gently come back. Can you hear the outside stuff on my microphone? Okay, good. Good. Okay, good. I was gonna separate and cut them off, close the door. So anything about all that stuff so far? I want to hear Chris's voice. Chris, will you speak to us from that shiny, smiley face of yours? I don't know.
I keep waiting for his mouth to start moving, and it just doesn't move.
Wait, here he comes, the voice from the picture.
I'm kind of listening right now. My kids got me sick. Plus, I'm glad you can't. I'm glad you can't hear anything in the background. I've been yelling at them a little bit. I've been a little disconnected there. Real spiritual back here, I'll tell you.
So it's his fault you got sick?
Yeah.
Take care of yourself.
They've been fighting with each other and all this stuff while I'm trying to listen. So it's been fun.
We're glad you're here, Chris. Thanks.
Yeah,
Thanks for being here.
We're glad you put up that smiley face instead of a sick self.
That's right. I want to see this.
We're all putting up a Dorian facade, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Absolutely.
Whether it's a storm or not.
We hang on to it for dear life. It's just so amazing, that we think it's us and we do everything to preserve and defend and protect it. Wow. It's wild. Yeah.
Let's go back to the beginning of the text and look at some of the miracle principles. He doesn't use the word loss in there, but he certainly uses the word lack. Lack is a very powerful word in the first 50 miracle principles, and in fact, it's in 4 of them. This emphasis on letting the miracle replaces the lack. And the first one's in miracle principle number 8, and we're on page 3 in the text. Miracles are healing because they supply a lack. Actually, they wake us up to there was no lack to begin with. They don't really supply anything. They just take away the blocks to our awareness that there was no lack. Kind of feels like they're supplying the lack because we thought we were lacking before, and now we wake up to that we're not. They are performed by those who temporarily have more for those who temporarily have less. Boy, that could give you a swelled head. As usual in the course, don't stop with that.
No.
Walk out trying to save everybody. And then lesson 34, or miracle principle number 34, on page 5. Miracles restore the mind to its fullness. We wake up to the fullness is already a done deal. Our innocence is the Son of God. By atoning for lack. The atonement is the undoing of our blocks to our awareness. There is no lack. By atoning for lack, they establish perfect protection. The Spirit's strength leaves no room, none for intrusions. That's why we don't ask the Spirit for help. We like intrusions. The ego likes them. And then 41 on the next page. Wholeness, no lack, no incompleteness. Wholeness is the perceptual content of miracles. They thus correct or atone for the faulty perception of lack. And then finally, 42 reiterates the same thing. A major contribution of miracles is their strength in releasing you and me from our false sense of isolation, deprivation, and lack. I looked up scarcity principle. It's funny that it's such a major theme in the Course, but Jesus only uses that phrase one time, and that's in the preface. The word scarcity he uses about 9 other times, but not he calls it the belief in scarcity, our identification with scarcity. But the idea of scarcity principle was big enough that Ken actually put it in his glossary and describes it. And the first 2 descriptions, I think, are really pertinent to our conversation. First thing Ken says is scarcity principle is an aspect of guilt. Period. Oh, without guilt, there can be no scarcity.
What else could it be, huh?
And then he says, it's the belief, no reality to it. It's just the belief that we are empty and incomplete, lacking what we need. It's all in there. Incomplete, lacking. I got needs now. The belief that we are empty and incomplete, lacking what we need. And then, of course, he goes on, this leads to all kinds of trouble, I'm paraphrasing, in special relationships where we try to fill those needs, where we try to fill the lack in the special relationships. Because now we're blaming the fulfillment of our needs on stuff external, or we're blaming our lack of fulfilling those needs on somebody who's blocking our needs being fulfilled. So that it's like boom, boom, boom. First there was the guilt, then there was scarcity, and now it's a mess of special relationships that prove it ain't my fault. It's all these people that are messing with me or not giving me what I need. In this case, it's Chris's kids. Jennifer, how you doing? You have any problem people in your life these days?
All the time. I mean, I have a thinking when you were back, I mean, just now you were talking about when people have lost somebody they love and they don't ask help for Jesus. And I have a thought that it's like that, I mean, grief and pain is what we think is love. I mean, like to grieve when somebody die, or you worry. That's how we show love in this world. Right. That we so believe is love.
Mm-hmm. Yep, you're right.
Yeah, Lynn, you better grieve when I die. Damn it.
There's going to be a big celebration.
I'm with you, Lynn.
We watched. I mean, the hurricane in the Bahamas was terrible, but there was a guy on there, and his wife just drowned in front of him, and he's going, "Oh, my poor little wife. She was on top of this cabinet, and the cabinet fell in, and my poor little wife drowned." And he's trying not to smile. I mean, it's obvious. It didn't mess him up at all. I mean, here he is talking to this reporter about it, and it just happened probably a few hours before. And I'm thinking, this guy is not grieving the way he should be grieving.
Either that, or he could have been in total shock. I mean, it was really kind of bizarre,
Well, except then the story goes, as he's telling the story, is he leaves the house and gets in his boat, and he doesn't drown. Now, and then there's a lot of questions about, well, why didn't he and his wife do that in the first place? So, I mean, it was a little bit too much. It remind me of what, if you don't grieve enough, what Jennifer was saying, you better grieve. You better drown to save me.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's good. Thanks, Jennifer. That's good. Lots of places in the course where he talks about even our, certainly the idea of sacrifice um, is really prevalent in the course, and it's really identified with lack or loss. That we've sacrificed, we literally sacrificed our relationship with God, and now we're in a state of loss, and now we believe it, and so we're grieving that loss. So he talks about that idea of sacrifice equating sacrifice with loss, equating sacrifice with lack, and then certainly the way we continue to sacrifice our true identity as the Son of God is now we run around believing we're bodies, insisting we're bodies. And bodies become kind of the buck stops here, where we insist that our innocence as the Son of God has been sacrificed. It's dead. And we have this new seeming reality as all these different bodies. So in chapter 26, in the beginning of chapter 26, we're on page 542. It's called the sacrifice of oneness. This is where everything started going downhill, is when we believe we actually sacrificed our oneness with our Father. And then that had to be like a domino effect, had to keep going in order to maintain our belief that we sacrificed our connection with our Father. The way we survive as a seeming individual, the way we survive even as a seeming body, is we insist we are these bodies separated from each other, and not only from God, but obviously from each other also. So the separation just keeps multiplying itself. Sacrifice just keeps multiplying itself. So, and he's talking about the dynamics of judgment in the first sentence. So page 542, chapter 26, section 1. In the dynamics of attack, in the dynamics of judgment of any kind, is sacrifice a key idea. It is the pivot upon which all compromise, all desperate attempts to strike a bargain, and all conflicts achieve a seeming balance. Kind of like, I won't judge you so much if you don't judge me so much, is basically what all the special love relationships are about. I'll be a little nice on you until the shoe drops and you let me down. I won't judge you so much until that happens. So it is the symbol of the central theme that somebody else must lose, one or the other. Separation, this insistency on sacrifice, that I've sacrificed my relationship with my Father, means the oneness is gone. And now there's two others happening, me and God, me and you, me and somebody. So it's an insistency on one or the other. In heaven, there's no one or the other, it's just oneness. But if I've killed that, and I believe I've killed that, then that gets played out in the world of form, and somebody must lose. Oneness must lose to prove to me that I'm still separate. Its focus on the body is apparent, for it is always an attempt to limit loss. Yeah, maybe I'm separate, but at least, I can get, if I manipulate people enough, I'll get something good out of them. I mean, this loss is terrible, but down here we get these little rushes of special love relationships where I think I'm actually getting something I need for a little while. It's an attempt to limit loss. This is total loss here. Nobody would stay here and hang out. So that's why it all got projected on the world. And special love gives us a little treat here and there to limit loss. We don't feel so devastated for at least a little while.
You know what's interesting is I'm sitting here listening to my kids fight, and they're, the two boys, and I'm like, man, the blaming our brother starts really early.
Oh yeah.
Yes, it does.
From birth, man, he's like, my brother did this and he did that, and he's yelling at me. He did this, and it's wild.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think who was it? I was somewhere where the person was saying that Ken used to say that right out of the womb, right out of the chute, when the baby cries, if you could decipher what he was saying, he's screaming, "It's not my fault. You did this." That's what the first cry was about. I've got needs and you better fulfill them. And if you don't, you're at fault.
Why'd you do this to me?
Yeah, right. Why'd you
I,
bring
did,
me?
I
Why'd you
didn't ask to be born.
bring? What's that?
I didn't ask to be born.
Yeah, exactly. Why'd you bring me
How
here?
dare you?
Not my fault.
Really?
Well, it seems that from the moment we come here, we came to fulfill this script. So we came with the idea that somebody must lose. And we reenact it. What does it take to keep a body? Well, we have to keep reenacting somebody must win and somebody must lose to keep perpetuating that idea of separate selves and separate bodies. So, if we really became more and more alert to how we're doing that all the time, it's like, I gotta win and you gotta lose, for me to preserve this. I've got to get my way. It's huge to realize that for me to preserve this personhood that I've imagined myself to be, I have to do that through habitual behavior. Or I would fade away. I would literally fade away from my memory if I didn't continue to perpetuate that. So this statement, somebody must lose, is the core of the thought system of scarcity and sacrifice.
Got to throw the sacrifice into the volcano every day to keep the machine going.
Yep.
Better the virgin than me.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
The first seeming guy that lost was God. He lost me as a son, and so that loss, since that is what gave me self-autonomy, was God losing his own son. The loss has to continue to maintain my autonomy. So in here, whatever we eat has to lose its life to maintain my life. Whatever I breathe, you can't breathe. Whatever I have, you can have. And then we make up laws about it to sustain that belief system. Societal laws, legal laws to protect what I think I have and keep you from stealing it back from me. I mean, it just goes on and on and on and on and on and on.
But there's absolutely nothing keeping us from stopping that right now.
Right. Except our seeming to forget to ask Jesus for help, to look at whoever or whatever it is a different way.
I think Tim's stopping me from doing it right now.
There you go.
He's stopping me.
Oh, good.
I'm blaming Tim.
It's his fault.
I was trying to do that. I didn't know it was working or not. Now I know it is.
As you're sharing that, I was picturing like two black holes, neither of which exist, both of which are trying to devour each other, and it's like, whenever you divide light into dark and dark, it's sort of like that, this inevitable, infinite struggle that happens that doesn't seem to have any ending until we just wait a minute, I made this up, I took this perfect oneness and believed I shattered it. And now those pieces have to battle themselves out, to the death. And
they have to.
But that's the only thing they know how to do is for the other part that seems to be separate. Yeah.
Unless we, retrain.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
What we're doing is trying to retrain, but we have to see what we're doing first.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, this idea that somebody must lose has to be brought to awareness that's what we're up to. And that's a really foreign idea. Everybody thinks they're doing nice by one another. So it's not exactly up for observation yet.
Look at all these charities I've donated to. I'm saving the planet, and on and on.
Yeah.
Yep.
Trying. Yeah.
Paragraph 2, he really goes into how we in the world that we think we see, this idea of the sacrifice of oneness is just totally locked in place. The world you see is based on sacrifice of oneness, paragraph 2. It is a picture of complete disunity and total lack of joining. Yeah, we kind of see that. Around each entity, around each body, is built a wall so seeming solid that it looks as if what is inside can never reach without, and what is out can never reach and join with what is locked away within the wall, our minds. Each part must sacrifice the other part. So, I mean, life has to eat life in order to stay alive, to keep itself complete. For if they joined, each one would lose its own identity, separate identity, and by their separation are their individual selves maintained. Sacrifice of oneness has to be, consistent and kept going continuously. The little that the body fences off becomes the self, preserved through sacrifice of all the rest. I'm not connected to nothing and nobody. And all the rest must lose this little part, remaining incomplete, to keep its own identity intact. Everybody else has to stay separate too. It's not just I'm insisting I'm separate, but everybody else has to be separate. Like it's dark versus dark. My dark's going to eat your dark, or your dark's going to eat my dark. But it's separate darks. Not really. I mean, it's all the same dark, but we actually believe the dark as separate persona. I was thinking about the body being a puppet, and, we make all these rules about the puppets. I mean, you can't take from this puppet in order to, there's rules about it's illegal to steal from this puppet. And it's like, that's why giving and receiving being the same is not at this level. It's just puppets playing with stuff. Mm-hmm. Puppet playing with puppet stuff. It's got nothing to do with the real giving and receiving that takes place in our mind.
Did you ever see the movie I Heart Huckabees?
I didn't know.
It's a somewhat unmemorable film, but there was one scene in it where Dustin Hoffman and Lily Tomlin, they were talking about, he used the analogy of he took a sheet and draped it over his hands, and he said, well, now this one figure comes out of this the sheet is kind of like a little puppet, and then there's another one over here, but he says, but the sheet kind of reminds us it's all the same thing. But that, there was just a moment of metaphysical insight in that movie that I thought was pretty cool.
Right.
And it was basically saying, it's really all the same thing, but there seem to be parts that are separate, warring with each other, but it's really the same thing. And it's just a misperception.
Yeah, the spirit in every
puppets basically fighting each other of the same thing.
Go ahead, Lynn.
Well, the spirit that's in every single part is the same. It's all the same, What's in me and in you and in every other one we would ever meet is the same spirit. I mean, that's what the Course is trying to get us to see, I think, or at least start to train our minds that that's what we would like to see. That would be the face of Christ, but to train our minds that, well, it must be possible. I would like that. All the same.
Yeah, and he kind of plays around with these different levels in this paragraph. Paragraph 3, line 3. In this perception of yourself as a body, the body's loss would be a sacrifice indeed. Well, hell yeah, it's all I got. It's me and me and me. Me, myself, and Irene. For sight of bodies becomes the sign that sacrifice is limited and something still remains for you alone. I have my own little limit over here. Don't take it away. And for this little to belong to you are limits placed on everything outside. All the laws and rules that say you can't take my little limit away. So we make up all kinds of rules about this, all kinds of laws, all kinds of limits about each little limited self gets to keep his limited self. Just as they are on everything you think is yours. For giving and receiving are really the same, and to accept the limits of a body is to impose these limits on your brother, whom you see, for you must see him as yourself. If I see myself as limited and separate, I have to see my brother that way. If I see myself as joined and one with Jesus and with you, I see you that way. It's always that. That's the giving and receiving part. If I give separation, I get separation. If I give forgiveness, I get forgiveness. And then, let me see. Let's go to section 2 in that page 544, section 2. And I wanted to look at paragraph 2. The Holy Spirit offers you release from every problem that you think you have. Whatever it is, whatever need you think you have, whatever loss you think you have, whatever separate identity you think you are that you need to maintain, all those problems that you think you have. They are the same to him because each one, regardless of the form it seems to take, is a demand that someone suffer loss and make a sacrifice that you might gain. My self-autonomy depends on others losing. And when the situation is worked out so no one loses, the problem's gone. Because it was an error in perception that now has been corrected. One mistake about form, about being invested in any form at all, is not more difficult for him to bring to truth than is another. Well, that's hard to believe down here in the world when, a loved one dies or your favorite pet, is sick or whatever's going on. That feels like the grief is coming from something here. But he's like uncompromising in this. One mistake is not harder for the Holy Spirit to deal with than another. And then the irony of what I think what we were talking about earlier is when course students don't ask for Jesus for help when they're going through the loss of a loved one. Almost like, well, he can't help. I just have to suffer through this until I stop suffering. No, we don't. No, we don't. I've seen people do it. I saw Lynn do it with her son. I saw this gentleman we know do it with his wife. I mean, it becomes a transcendent experience instead of a horrific grieving thing. I mean, it's really amazing to see, and it's amazing to experience. For there is but one mistake, the tiny mad idea of loss. That's the one mistake. The whole idea that loss is even possible and could result in gain for anyone. If this were true, then God would be unfair, sin would be possible, attack be justified, and vengeance fair. Well, that's what's all going on down here, everything he just said. God is unfair. How often do you hear, my life's unfair? Why was God so unfair to me? Sin is possible. Look at all the people sinning. Attack, judgment is justified for God's sake. Look at all the crazies running around. Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord. No, it's not. Vengeance is mine, saith me. I know how you should be punished. This one mistake, this belief in the tiny mad idea of loss, in any form has one correction. There is no loss. Period. To think there is not a sin, it's just a mistake. There is no loss. You have no problems, though you think you have. And yet you could not think so if you saw them vanish one by one. And that's what Jesus shows us. They start evaporating like crazy. We just invite them into the situation. Without regard to size, however dramatic it seems to be, complexity, place or time, or any attribute which you perceive that makes each one seem different, some more crazy than the rest. They're all the same. Think not the limits you impose on what you see can limit God in any way. And then I wanted to, before we do the closing meditation, I wanted to read paragraph 7. Bruce, you want to read 7, please?
Sure. Think then how great your own release will be when you are willing to receive correction for all your problems. You will not keep one, for pain in any form you will not want. And you will see each little hurt resolved before the Holy Spirit's gentle sight. For all of them are little in His sight, and worth no more than just a tiny sigh before they disappear, to be forever undone and unremembered. What seemed once to be a special problem, a mistake without a remedy, or an affliction without a cure, has been transformed into a universal blessing. Sacrifice is gone, and in its place the love of God can be remembered and will shine away all memory of sacrifice and loss.
Can't be that easy, right?
Wow.
Yeah, really.
Yeah.
Closing meditation, lesson 284. I think over the years this has become one of my favorite one of the little lessons in the back. Lesson 284, it's on page 437, or 439, I'm sorry. Yeah, lesson 284, page 439. Lynn, you want to read that one? And where it talks about no grief and everything's just a dream and everything just grief and pain and all that bad stuff.
Oh, it sounds really delicious. All right. You mean I can elect to change all thoughts that hurt? That one?
Or you can elect to keep all thoughts you think hurt.
I think I'll go for door number 1. I can elect to change all thoughts that hurt. Loss is not loss when properly perceived. Pain is impossible. There is no grief with any cause at all. And suffering of any kind is nothing but a dream. This is the truth. At first to be but said and then repeated many times, and next to be accepted as but partly true with many reservations. Then to be considered seriously more and more, and finally to be accepted as the truth. I can elect to change all thoughts that hurt. And I would go beyond these words today and past all reservations and arrive at full acceptance of the truth in them. Father, what you have given cannot hurt, so grief and pain must be impossible. Let me not fail to trust in you today, accepting but the joyous as your gifts, accepting but the joyous as the truth.
Gently come back. Boy, that gives a whole new meaning to election day.
Wow.
This is election day.
That's an awesome lesson.
Mm.
Mm-hmm. Yes, we can elect.
And even Chris can elect to see his kids a different way, or in spite of their screaming and blaming and
I just put in earplugs.
oh, that works too.
Feel better soon, Chris. Take care.
Yeah, thanks, guys. Have a good night.
So good to see you, Jennifer. Great to see you, Bruce.
Good night, y'all. Good
Night.
morning, y'all.
Night, everybody.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.